In the tradition of Malcolm X, peace be unto you. Everyone knows now that the Flint River in Flint, Michigan, for over a year was polluted with lead and other destructive chemicals, chemicals destructive to the human body. Lead, we know, in the water of Flint, Michigan, is no accident, and it occurs nationwide in every major city of the United States, and it has been occurring for over 100 years. But before I discuss how lead and other metals, as well as drugs and sugar, are used to literally dumb down African Americans and Latinos and poor people generally, I want to summarize to you a famous allegory so that you can see for yourself that the process of polluting water with deadly chemicals has been a tactic, a political policy, if you will, to control other human beings. Because there is an ongoing attempt to control the lower classes so that they are kept in their designated places in society, whether that is doing menial labor or to live a life of crime and incarceration. Let me talk to you first about a novel that was written in 1931 entitled A Brave New World. It was written by Aldous Huxley, a famous writer. In that book, he describes a totalitarian state. And that totalitarian state had developed technology that enabled it to chemically alter embryos into 5 basic groups or castes. And as you know, a caste is a position in society into which you are born and you cannot leave. The castes were named the Alpha, Beta, Gamma, Delta, and Epsilon. There was one other group described in the novel called savages or primitives who lived outside of the totalitarian boundaries. And they reproduced physically as people do now. They were outcasts. Now, in the novel, he describes the process by which Gamma, Delta, and Epsilon embryos underwent a chemical alteration, which involved shocking an egg so that it divides to form up to 96 identical embryos, which then develop into 96 identical human beings. And the alpha and beta embryos, in contrast to that, never underwent that dividing process because it was known that the dividing process weakened the embryos. Now, the leaders of that particular totalitarian state in the novel explained that the process facilitated social stability because the clones it produces are predestined to perform identical tasks at identical machines, sort of like an ant colony. The cloning process is one of the tools the world state used to implement its guiding motto, which is in the book called Community, Identity, Stability. In that particular process, 70% of the female fetuses are sterilized, and they are known as free martins. That is to say, they are always sexually available for the pleasure of the elite. The fetuses undergo different treatments depending upon their caste. For example, it states in the novel that oxygen deprivation and alcohol treatment ensured lower intelligence and smaller physical sizes of members of the three lower castes. Also, it conditioned them to hate books. And that was so they would be prevented from wasting the community's time reading books that might decondition them, wake them up. Fetuses destined for work in the tropical climate were heat conditioned as embryos. During childhood, they underwent further conditioning to produce adults that are emotionally and physically suited to hot climates. I'm sure you can see how this process is unfolding. It aimed to make individuals accept and even like their inescapable social destiny. Now, one of the characters went on to explain in the book that future rocket plane engineers were conditioned to live in constant motion, and future chemical workers were conditioned to tolerate toxic chemicals. And there was the highest caste called the Alpha Plus. They were the intellectuals, the leaders, the scientists who maintained the totalitarian state and the rigid order of social control. Conditioning individuals genetically, physically, and psychologically for their inescapable social destinies, they argued, stabilizes the caste system by creating servants who love and fully accept their servility. Does this sound familiar? Moreover, conditioning makes them virtually incapable of performing any other function than that to which they were assigned. So no matter what they could possibly think of, they couldn't do it, even if they could think of it, which they couldn't because they had been conditioned and chemically treated to have a lower intelligence level. One other point that I want to make about this novel is that a drug called soma, a pleasure drug, was used to relax the leaders. It stimulated what is called the reptilian or serpent part of the human brain, the pleasure center of the brain. And that was often used as a reward to control themselves and each other. The story of the Brave New World is an allegory of real practices. That's what I'm getting at. Real practices that are carried out this very day, this very moment, by the shadow government, which controls the federal, state, county, and city governments throughout this nation. Because if we're going to talk about chemicals and we're going to talk about metals polluting our water and our air, then we've got to talk about the companies that manufacture those chemicals and the power that they have in our society to control the politicians who promote their policies to the public. Now, I have a question for you. Who benefits? Who benefits if your children are made irreversibly brain damaged such that they cannot compete academically or in markets that require professional skills? You know as well as I do that experimenting on African American people goes back to slave breeding plantations and the Tuskegee experiment, which everybody pretty much is aware of today. On breeder plantations, mothers, fathers, sons, cousins were forced to copulate with one another to produce babies for the slave master to sell, especially after 1809. That practice made thousands upon thousands of retarded or psychologically impaired offspring. And one of the effects of that kind of inbreeding is lowered IQ or intelligence deprivation. In an article by a scientist by the name of N.E. Morton, he states in an article entitled Effective Inbreeding on IQ and Mental Retardation, a number of studies indicate that IQ declines and the frequency of mental retardation increases with inbreeding, end quote. Those offspring on those breeder plantations with genetic defects would pass on those genetic defects to many generations to come. And those defects are still prevalent among our people in the African American community. It was a way to dumb down African American people and, of course, make money doing so, well into the future. Next, we have the rise of autism, a genetic defect. Autism is generally symptomatic of a genetic defect. However, it can also be a socially constructed condition. And that's what I'd like you to focus on as we continue this conversation, this discussion. Socially constructed autism in the Black community is done for the purpose of making a dystopic or undesirable and frightening complex of antisocial relations between Black people. Autism has specific characteristics. Specialists define it as being a developmental disorder that varies widely in severity. Autism is marked by communication problems, speech impediments, for example, social difficulties, learning to cooperate with others, for example, accommodating others, for example, having the capacity for empathy, and often repetitive behaviors. Now, repetitive behaviors observed in children would be, for example, hand flapping, just shaking the hands continually, or rocking in a chair, and head banging on a wall or floor. Those are examples of repetitive behaviors. Autism is a complex developmental disorder that affects the brain's normal development of social and communication skills. Now, where I'm headed with this is I want you to understand that lead poisoning causes the same kinds of characteristics. They cause people to be impaired with regard to their social interactions, problems processing information from their senses. They are less able to form emotional bonds with others. A recent study of a U.S. metropolitan area estimated that 3.4 of every 1,000 children ages 3 to 10 had autism. And it stated that a disproportionate number of those children are Black. Now, when we add on top of those children who suffer a genetic defect we call autism, those children who have been exposed to lead in the water such that it damages their brain and causes them to exhibit the same dysfunctional behavior, you may well imagine the magnitude of this problem. How would one group go about socially constructing autism in another group that they want to control for the purpose of exploitation or elimination? They would put lead in the environment. They would put lead in the environment where those people live, work, and play. And they would do it without telling them, just as was the case in Flint, Michigan, and in other cities throughout the United States. Why would they do it? The answer is to make them non-competitive in higher skill professions, to eliminate them over time, to rationalize defining them as inferior, as was the case in the novel, The Brave New World. Now, one effect of lead poisoning is lowered IQ, just as in autism caused by genetic defect. Lowered IQ simply means you have a lower or lowered intelligence capacity. There are simply abstract areas of intelligence that you're just simply not able to learn. Math, Higher abstract levels of literature are not accessible by you. A nationwide survey in the United States done between 1976 and 1980 found that 3.5% of children under the age of 5 had lead levels well above the medical intervention threshold. Now let me give you some more numbers. The total number of children, school children, was about 16 to 19 million, implying that about 590,000 children in the country between the ages of 6 months and 5 years are overexposed to lead and may be suffering from lead poisoning. Now ask yourself this question: as those children grow, how are those behaviors going to be reflected in testing, in academic testing, in the learning of basic skills, speech skills? There was a marked racial difference in lead risk. That means black people are more likely to be at risk for lead poisoning than other ethnic groups in the United States. With about 10.2% or 264,000 black children, as compared to only 1.8% of white children showing elevated lead levels. When the threshold of lead concentration is lowered, still even more so, the number of preschool children at risk increases to 3.5 million, with black children accounting for, please listen to this, 30% of the total, or 1,500,000 black children, not including those exposed over the past 30 years. How much of the incarceration of black people reflects exposure to lead poisoning? How much of the violence in our community reflects exposure to not only lead in the environment, but other toxic pollutants? Those are questions I hope you stop and ask yourself. And who is responsible for testing the levels of these particular chemicals in our community? It's the Environmental Protection Agency. It long ago concluded that there is a national health problem associated with exposure to environmental lead for the general population and in particular for preschool children. But this was known long ago. I have literature here written by ancient Romans who knew that lead exposure caused brain damage because they wrote about it. Sheets of lead were used to line Roman aqueducts, and lead pipes to convey water, and cups from which they drank were made with lead. And they observed the damage it did to people. It caused people to go insane, and it dumbed down poor people in Rome at that time. So this was not something unknown. Even 100 years ago, they understood that lead poisoning may well have helped the Roman Empire fall. In our nation, over 100 years ago, companies mobilized and promoted the use of lead in products, knowing full well that it was poisonous, that it was destructive. They used lead in light bulbs that we've been using for over 100 years. They used lead paint for toys manufactured for children. They used lead in gasoline and didn't stop that until 1975. And there are articles after article which states how lead caused people to commit suicide. People who worked in factories that used high concentrations of lead in their products. The Center for Disease Control in the United States now recommends that all children 9 months to 6 years of age should be screened for lead at least once annually. Ask yourself, has your child been screened at least once annually between 9 months and 6 years? Note that the CDC recommends testing, but also note Congress has not made it a law that all states report the amount of lead in water and other infrastructures. Many states do not report the lead content in their water. Why? It is because most of the urban piping in the ground and in homes is over 100 years old and coated with lead, as well as homes over 50 years old painted with lead paint. That's why. It has been known, as I stated, that lead kills. In 1974, the Safe Drinking Water Act was passed, but it did not authorize the EPA to monitor schools directly. Instead, the agency depends upon the school's water providers, to comply with its monitoring requirements, and it relies on states to enforce violations. In an article written in the New York Times, it reported that more than 49 million people in the United States were exposed to drinking water containing illegal concentrations of chemicals like arsenic and radioactive substances such as uranium. The report also found that just 6% of drinking water violations were actually enforced since 2004. Let me reiterate that. Let me repeat that. Only 6% of the violations were actually enforced. It forced one senator to say he was troubled by the evidence that shows chemicals and other substances are polluting the nation's water supply, including chemicals, he says, contaminate water at such high concentrations that the mixture is toxic enough to set aflame, end quote. Right now, there are more than 140 chemicals in our drinking water that the EPA doesn't regulate, according to a recent study. In some parts of the country, chemicals including gasoline, additive, pesticides, even rocket fuel are found in our drinking water. In an article in Wikipedia, it reports the discovery of widespread lead contamination in Washington, D.C. in its drinking water resulted in a U.S. congressional investigation that damaged the scientific reputation of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. It left thousands of children with lifelong health risks, and that was years before the incident we know of today in Flint, Michigan. In fact, they found that the lead levels were 83 times higher than the accepted safe limit. Washington, D.C. at that time was predominantly African American, and so thousands of African Americans were damaged by lead contaminated water and have suffered more or less throughout their lives. But instead of identifying those chemical causes for aberrant behavior, racist, white supremacists would use the statistics to justify their fallacious premises of racial inferiority. These facts underscore a very likely scenario. One, we have been living in the brave new world that was allegorically described by Aldous Huxley for a very long time. We are in the brave new world. We have been chemically altered. We have been chemically dumbed down. And much of the dysfunction that we see is the result of the exposure that we have suffered from the chemicals put in our environment purposely, intentionally to harm us. Two, black children have been disproportionately exposed to lead in our environment. Three, black children have been administered IQ tests for over 100 years by those who knew that a large percentage of black children had been brain damaged by lead in the environment. Nevertheless, the IQ test scores of brain damaged black children and adults were intentionally used to calculate the average IQ for a whole range of age groupings of black people. And those scores were used to support the white supremacist premise that black people everywhere in the world are inherently less intelligent than white people. All IQ test scores dating back 100 years are invalid and should be trashed, because millions of people were poisoned intentionally to lower their IQ capacity. Black people have been and are now exposed to lead in their water pipes, their wall paint, because they live in older housing units, and air to purposely dumb them down, just as were the Gamma, Delta, and Epsilon casts in Huxley's Brave New World. And for what? To maintain control of black people. Is that why the high school dropout rate among black people is so high? Is that why black people underperform in mathematics nationwide? Over 70% below proficiency in math, below 70% proficiency, or rather 70% of black people scoring below proficiency in reading. Is that why? What about crime? It was demonstrated that there's a positive correlation between lead exposure and violent crime, such that after lead was taken out of gasoline and children were tested, there was a drop in violent crime as the lead levels dropped in the environment. May that not explain some of the high incarceration rate problems that we have today? Violent crimes for black men and women? I think to some degree that is the case. But we'll never know until the government decides to clean up the environment, which it won't. And it won't because it is controlled by the shadow government. The shadow government, which pays the politicians to write the laws and implement the policies that favor them. I am Dr. Stephen Nur Ahmed. Peace be unto you.